we were moving to an industrial revolution. Farmers became superfluous to the people in power. And when it was really magnified, was probably in the elections that occurred later in the 20th century. I would say post JFK, probably Lyndon Baines Johnson and Nixon is when food prices became an actual issue in the election. And people don't even know how we got the dietary pyramid, but it was because of a senator and Nixon. They wanted to eliminate food ever being an option in an election. So they wanted cheap food. So what did we do? We came up with this dietary pyramid that if you eat like it, you'll look like a pyramid. But they made all cheap foodstuffs. And then what was the next step? Companies in the Midwest like ADM and Cargill, I'm just throwing a couple names out there, even John Deere, they became centralized. And basically we went from mom and pop farms to these big industrial food cooperatives. And who got fucked in the whole situation, which was the farmers. Ultimately, though, when farmers get tagged, so does the public. And we certainly did. The same thing is now being recapitulated by the World Economic Forum and the World Health Organization in Europe. See, the reason why Europe has a better food system than we do is because they resisted centralization for so long. And anybody who's taken a trip to Europe in the last 50 or 60 years can see the difference. Like when, for example, if you go south of Chicago, all the way to the Illinois-Kentucky border, you'll notice something very bizarre. It's nothing but farmland, but the farms are owned by industrial corporations. The same thing is true when you go to Iowa. Same thing is true when you go to Nebraska. Same thing is true in Arkansas. There's very few farmers really left. And I always like to tell the story, about the 1968 election, that if you looked back then at the USDA at that time had 88,000 people in it for the bureaucracy, and there was about 3 million farmers. Today, there's, I think, 3.8 million people in the USDA, and there's only about 800,000 farmers. So you're talking literally in one human lifetime that it's been completely flipped. And what you'll notice with anything, when administrators dominate the producers, that should make you start thinking about Atlas Shrugged, because that's exactly what's going on. And the same thing that happened to us in food actually happened in medicine. The flip of the switch there was in 1986 when Harvard came out with the idea of using CPT codes. And what happened at that time? Administrators and hospitals went up and doctors' powers went down. And if you actually look at who gets paid most of the money now, it's actually administrators and not the doctors. So centralization is everywhere you look. But you know what the big problem is, at least in my view, is that you can tell people this information. They don't do their own homework. They don't read. I mean, it's one of my big things with my own tribe. I'm like, from this coding thing, I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent, but I think it plays to the point you're asking me. From the Harvard 1986 CPT stuff, when they decided they wanted to centralize medicine, what was the effect? Where did it end? It ended in 2008, 2009 with Obamacare. And most people don't understand really what the purpose of Obamacare was. Obamacare was to take doctors' time and make it smaller for patients. In other words, you had to see 50, 60 patients a day so that you couldn't read. And if you couldn't read and stay up on the literature, that meant that you really had no control of science. Then they came up with another idea called evidence-based medicine, which is basically we're going to upload in your brain what we want you to know. We did it in medical school through the curriculum. We did it in residency the same way. And when you're out, we're going to do it to you again. And the goal of Obamacare was to limit doctors' time. So if you really wanted to be a true doctor to your patients, you actually had to cut fun out in your life and you had to cut your family life down. That's the only way for you to stay up on the literature. So it was basically a way to cut your time. In your business and farming, that's what regulations do. They actually take you away from being a producer. That's actually how things become centralized. And people don't realize that deregulation doesn't allow things to be captured. That's how the CDC, the FDA, the USDA, you name any of the bureaucracies that are present in the United States, they're all regulatory captured. And at the same time, the industrial military complex, how did they enforce all of these things? It was very simple. They captured the executive branch first. That's what they did with Groves and Truman. And then they captured the legislative branch. And they did that really after they killed JFK because they basically had made everybody aware on Capitol Hill that they would go to that length to control the paradigm in power. And then they followed it up by killing Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy's dad in 68. So it didn't stop. And then, people still think, I got into a very interesting argument with a big Bitcoiner this year in a Clubhouse room 6 months ago. And I said, look, they're going to try to kill Trump. And everybody's like, no, they're not going to do that. That game plan went out in the 60s and 70s. I said, I don't think you really understand what's going on here. All through the lawfare, what is lawfare about, both for Trump and for Bobby Kennedy and Nicole Shanahan? It's the same thing as Obamacare was, my friend. It's about taking you away from being productive. Like, you can't be a productive politician if you're in fucking court fighting the paradigm in power. The problem is a lot of people don't see what you and I are talking about now. Like, I always tell people, the handwriting is right there, but can you read what's out there? And I tell people the reason why they can't read is because their melanin sheets between their five senses is degraded by design so that you don't see the truth. And then when the paradigm tells you, oh, this is conspiracy theory, Jack Cruz and people of his ilk are not here to tell you the truth. Here's why I'm a problem for the paradigm. I know fucking history better than just about anybody. I also know what's happened in medicine. I know what's happened in other industries.
And you should too. That's why we gotta listen to Uncle Jack sometimes over here, breaking it down beautifully. Guess what is not beautiful? This motherfucking system. It ain't that harmonious. Little out of sync, this bitch. The experts, they ain't experting anymore. They're looking their needle in the haystack, but they're missing the beauty of the whole field. That's nature, everything is everything. We freaking specialized to the maximum by design. And then even these specialized guys don't have time to do any of that shit anymore because of these regulations and new rules and laws. So they get even dumber with their specialization. But even that bad is wrong. You should be generalist, like nature. You should see that everything is everything. You should see the whole big picture, what's going on. That's how we could make this system harmonious. But these guys don't want that. No. That would be very bad business for them. But we need to get that message out there. We need that base knowledge. And that real science. Base science.